Welcome back to today's guest lecture. Okay, so I am very happy to introduce to you Philipp von der Wippel from Project Together. And I think my first question to you is, who is the youngest person in the audience? Who's maybe the youngest? Is there somebody around 20, beginning of the 20s? How old are you? 20, okay, then we have somebody who's younger. So we just wondered whether Philipp is actually the youngest guest speaker that we had here on stage. And I think it's super interesting given that, we have seen all the corporate presentations, we have seen NGOs on stage and so on. And now towards the end of the semester, we said we're looking more towards the future, right? We look at the future topics, social business, innovative business models, and so on. And Philipp is one of the persons currently that I would say is really pushing the topic in Germany. So everywhere where you go and people talk about sustainability, you will probably come across Philipp and hear about his projects. So I think it's actually we are very lucky that he has the time to come to Mannheim and to speak to us. And I think he will have a lot of interesting stories to tell. So basically, Philipp did a lot of his studies in the UK, and in the UK I think you rather kind of stumbled onto this topic, right? You started a project that you really felt strongly about with a good friend. You probably tell the story, right? And then he started to really engage in change making in the area of social business and sustainability. And Project Together is basically a platform that is now very well known, and I think there might be also links for you guys to interact with Project Together in the future. I'm very happy that you are here to talk to us, and thank you. The stage is yours.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much for the introduction. And so I will hang this over, otherwise you will not hear me very well. Can you hear me very well? Okay, perfect. So thanks again for the invitation, and it's very cool to have the time with you this evening. So let's start. I mean, first of all, let's make it like that. You always raise the question when they come up. We will have some time at the end, but this is mostly about discussion. I will just share the experiences from the practical field and how we push social entrepreneurship with respect to the big corporates, but also with some respect to current policy making. And it's really interesting to have your questions, and I will just build them into the things I want to share. Because you just mentioned it, maybe it helps a little bit for the background, how I really stumbled over social entrepreneurship and this entire new actor in the field in a way. At the age of 16, I had a short period in the UK, not the UK you have in mind, not the Oxford, Cambridge, London, but it was more the northwest. So it was the Lancaster region, sort of close to Manchester. And I got there as a normal 16 years old student, and I met a friend, Ibrahim, his family at the time was from Syria, and he really experienced in 2012 what it feels like if there's a crisis where many relatives, many friends back home in Homs are personally threatened, and if you as an individual cannot do really anything about it. And I met him exactly when he was in a sort of a personal crisis to ask himself, like, what could he do as a more or less powerless young high school student. And what actually developed out of that, it was basically pure coincidence. Many coincidences came together, but it was basically what happened is that he said, well, maybe this is the opportunity to launch a campaign and to develop formats of how we can actually bridge distance in the way that the news we get from other countries, the catastrophes, the daily reportings of the killings, how is it possible in an age where we are so interconnected, how do we really create empathy to distant places? I think and it was a really interesting proposition, and then we started to think about, okay, how do we really close this distance and really bring Syria into proximity into the UK of everyday student life. and we started to test certain products. I mean, products in a sense of just starting streaming live Skype conferences to bombing areas and to see how people react and whether they start any sort of action. And out of that, it really became like a self-reinforcing campaign. It spread all over this area. The local MPs, or the Member of Parliament, contacted us 4 months later saying, well, this is a really interesting new way of dealing with international news. He basically pushed it so far that we got invited to Downing Street, and Ibrahim finally actually presented the entire campaign in front of the House of Commons in July 12, 2012. So this is just a founding story, what happened to me, and I think that's the reason why I'm here today, because this personal experience of not being an object of society only, but really being a subject, and even as a really young person, that it can happen that you suddenly engage with international politics and decision makers you otherwise only know from TV. This really raised the question within myself. This experience, is it possible that we replicate that, right? So is it possible that not only this one young person managed to start something off in a really entrepreneurial way, right, without any structures given, and it, for coincidence, it was taken up by a big institution like the British Parliament. Can we replicate this process? And this question basically then straight away brought me to the idea of social businesses, social entrepreneurship, in the way saying, like, as we have innovation in tech, we need innovation in society. And this brings me to the topic of today, because the main proposition is, as you all read, sustainable is the new digital. And this really sums it up in one sentence. I will explain what I mean by that and what are my experiences on that, but I really want you to engage with this proposition. So the idea is basically that sustainability and this trend is really comparable to the trend of digitalization, which we experienced in the last 20 years. And I'm very confident from everything we see that sustainability will disrupt existing business models and will give birth to new business models. Or to make it even clearer, and that's the main proposition, social change will fundamentally disrupt the existing business models in a severe way, as digital business models have done it in the last 10 years. And this is a big proposition, and there are many assumptions behind that, and that's what this talk is all about. So please feel free to ask questions whenever they come up. So just as a background, where do I base this big proposition on, or like what's the framework sort of? I will go pretty quickly into the practical part and the experiences, but nevertheless, so the frameworks, I'm deeply convinced, and the frameworks I learned in the UK when I studied there in the last 3 years, is that business and business models and the preferences of customers and supply and demand and all that is fundamentally about what we value and what we consider as costs. So you see already in there, like, what we consider is in a way subjective and not kind of a priori, so like predefined. It can change, and this means like whether business models are profitable depends on what society values and what society considers as costs. I mean, it's quite straightforward, but in many economic models, it seems like that companies only have one way to produce, and customers, basically based on their preferences, only have one way to choose, and this will be forever. And maybe then there are technological developments like digital platforms and like the rise of the internet, and they can increase the productivity. They can increase the productivity, so it decreases the it decreases the costs, and it kind of brings more added value to the customer. But basically, what the customer or what society values sort of stays constant, and that's what I fundamentally challenge. I think what we experience right now is that apart from the fact that we actually increase our productivity through technology, at the same time, what we value, like value in the sense like what is it we really kind of have, where we identify worth with it, this is fundamentally changing. And as far as I know, most of the models don't recognize it yet. So basically the baseline is price is an endogenous function, so based on what we value, but at the same time what we consider as costs. And what I mean with consider as costs is that, I go here, that if you take, for example, the smoking ban, right? The smoking ban in restaurants happened 10 years ago. And now, some of the business models actually do not work anymore, because like, it was fundamentally part of the restaurant culture in Germany and basically all over the world that people were smoking in there, right? So, for example, cigarettes got sold in the restaurants. It was fundamentally part of the industry, of the tobacco industry, to supply cigarettes and cigars and all that to restaurants. And suddenly, this was not the case anymore. Why? Because society realized that there's a cost, a fundamental health cost, if people smoke in restaurants and basically fundamentally negatively affect all the other people in the restaurant. This health cost of smoking, of course, was already existing before we realized 10 years ago, 15 years ago. It was already existing before we banned it. But suddenly we considered it as a cost. And so the same, we can even go far back in history. If you think about slavery, right? Most of the business models, when you go 100, 200, 300, like more 300, 400 years back, many of the business models worked because the labor of a fundamental proportion of the working population was not considered as cost and was not properly paid. So the business model worked because basically they produced something, they created output. At the same time, the cost of their labor was not considered as a cost, and of course then the business model works. Once you factor in the cost of the labor, here in this example of the then sort of normally considered slavery, then of course it doesn't work anymore. We can go on with many examples of more modern value shifts. We can think about what are the business models which do not work anymore since family structures and the work split between, for example, men and women is changing. What are the business models which actually rely on the assumption of society that once there are children, the husbands basically go to work and the women stay at home? What are the business models which are actually relying on this fundamental societal premise? So this is kind of this is the part I want to go with you. I mean, this is the thing I found on Wikipedia, basically explaining value shifts or on the other side, more the social costs. So here, basically I chose a framework for the social costs. And it's pretty clear that once you factor in the social costs, for example, the labor of 300 years ago slaves, which have not been factored in, then of course the business model might not work anymore. And the same is with value shifts. Once customers do not actually put so much value anymore to something, then some things which might be profitable before will not be profitable anymore. So before we get into this, one step back, are there any questions to these propositions? Does this make sense, or any further examples needed? Okay, let's go on. So to get one step deeper, the question is, why do values shift? I mean, why do we put more value to something which we haven't done before? Why do we suddenly start considering costs, social costs, environmental costs, civil society costs, which have not been considered as costs before? Or more concretely speaking, under which conditions does society start internalizing costs which they did not consider at all before? Question to you. What do you think? What are those trigger points? Based on the examples, maybe also which I just provided. Who wants to share something? Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So it's basically awareness, knowledge, which society ignored or just didn't know before. Yeah. So I think this is a perfect example. I think it's exactly a combination of values and value. Maybe a good idea of how to think about it is when you shift your personal values, you redefine the way you want to see yourself in the world, in a way. Value shift always has to do something with how do I see myself and how do I see my surrounding, and am I happy with the way I see myself right now? And then in combination, it's the awareness, and of course, the more we actually see the consequences of our of all the things we do. I mean, the more we see the consequences of climate change, the more we see the pollution of plastics, of course, this makes awareness more or less inevitable. So yeah, the urgency of certain environmental crises, definitely trigger the level of awareness. So good so far. One thing which is so interesting to see right now, that pressure on those sustainability topics towards business is not only coming from one group. It's not only from the customers, from the next generation of customers like you and me, or the people going to the street on Fridays. It's really about at least those 5 categories. So starting, of course, with the customers, saying like, okay, if we take you as a customer and you go to a shop and suddenly you are more willing to pay a higher price, then this certainly shifts the dynamic of how the business calculates its business model. Or suddenly you're not willing to buy a really low price product anymore because it is produced from a specific company you're not trusting anymore. So of course customers is a big force, but at the same time it's the same for the employees. I've been to a company 2 weeks ago, and actually an employee stood up and after like 1 minute she broke out into tears because she said it's so intimidating that when she's outside of the company and speaking to friends, she doesn't dare to speak anymore. She doesn't dare to tell other people about the fact that she's working for this specific company, because this company has been really badly in the press in the last few months. I will not mention the name here because it's recorded. But the same with investors and owners. So when you think about Germany, many of the companies are still owned by families, and the next generation of families is taking over is basically taking over their ownership, and they fundamentally question the way their capital is used, and they are starting putting pressure on the management of the companies they are taking over. And this is a major force right now, because individuals like you and me, for coincidence, they are inheriting wealth, and inheriting maybe a big German company, but they also ask themselves, what do I want to do with my life, and exactly what do I do with the power I'm given? So I know many young people in this position right now, and this is a big pressure force as well. Regulation. So plastic is a perfect example. We have there at least the first step of regulation of single-use plastic is released from Brussels, and further regulation is yet to come. And this suddenly shifts an entire business agenda, because once there's regulation, there's no way for companies to deviate from it. So, and public reputation, last but not least, is a major thing, especially in times of social media, whenever anyone can publish a video straight away. If you spot any maldoing from some companies or this behavior, it will be spread in a few minutes. So this just as a main drivers of all the different actors, basically, who really are part of this change towards sustainable business. So here is the next generation, and we also see top CEOs in the US committing publicly that their companies have to shift away from shareholder value, because otherwise those companies will not have any license to operate anymore in the future. So this just happened a few months ago, including Amazon's Jeff Bezos. So again, I will involve you a second time. What I just kind of tried to introduce is a framework of how to think about the relationship between social trends, value shifts, the creation and the change of norms, and how we directly can relate it to business models. Business models which might be profitable today and not be profitable anymore tomorrow, or business models which would never which would never been profitable a few years ago, and suddenly they are profitable because customers are willing to pay for it, or because regulation has incentivized these new business models. We will go into examples, but I want you to ask, what do you consider as mega trends in society, maybe other big trends where you feel that those will be really important in the next years? Just in terms of societal trends, social problems maybe, big challenges you see for the next 30 or 40 years. Just the first question, not the other ones. We go there bit by bit. Yeah, definitely. So keep this one because we will need it for the next ones. I'll go back to you. Any others? So perfect. So they are all big social trends. I mean, there are many others. I mean, certainly, for example, mental health is a big topic. You can think about the entire realm of finance, but I mean, these examples are perfect, and we will go back to these ones right away, because the question is, if you think about those trends, so we had aging, we had climate, we had the two or three other ones, there's no right and wrong answer. It's just about brainstorming now. What do these trends change in economic behavior? Let's put it like, what do these trends could change in economic behavior? Or differently speaking, if you think about those challenges, like an aging society, if you think about climate and the climate crisis really getting severe and we're really feeling the consequences in Europe, and if you think about the question of societies welcoming big groups from outside, and the examples we've just had. What do you think, what could get more value? Like, what are things we might put more value to it, where we put more value to than we did 20 years ago? Or where do you think certain costs or negative effects are getting kind of more valued, in the sense that we are more willing to internalize those costs? Let's go maybe bit by bit, and you can take a few seconds to think about it. So we had aging society, we had refugees, we had climate. What else did we have? It's a long day. What are the, yeah, nevertheless, it's good. So, yeah. Who wants to start? Anyone with ideas of like what could, maybe just a personal opinion of what you think you might value more in the future than you do today? Yeah, 100%. So it's all about insurance. People suddenly live so much longer, and much more people are in need of care. And for the statistics, for example, say that until 2050, 11% of the population will be in need of active care. This is 9 million people, so there's no way our care system can deal with it right now. So it's a huge interest. We will be, for sure, we will be willing to pay a lot for our parents, grandparents really be taken care in a like decent way. Definitely. Any other things where you feel that we will put more value to it? It's a perfect example. We already see today that suddenly, because family structures and traditional structures of community have been dissolving, and people therefore more and more suffer under mental health. I just read a statistics yesterday that the level of depression has, I think, more than doubled under, even especially in the generation under 30 since the last 10 years. So it's an extreme development. And of course, apart from the customers, really they really need the prevention mechanisms, and society as a whole is not really dealing well with this topic. Apart from that, it's a huge cost factor. So mental health, in a way that mental health measured in the days people are absent in their business is one of the biggest cost factors for our economy. So there's a huge business case in that. So it's already kind of linked to the last question, and you can take this question with you based on the analysis of the first and the second question. What are business models you could think of which might not be profitable today, which might be really ahead of the curve, in the sense of ahead of the time? But if you think about those trends like aging, care, like welcoming big groups of people from other countries, climate change, plastic pollution, if these trends get really more severe, as they obviously get, I mean, most of those trends, there's no sign that they will stop will stop soon. What are the business models which might get profitable, because we will value, and we will put much more value to it once those crises get more severe? So this was kind of the idea. And now, I mean, we've been thinking about different trends, and of course, those trends are all not all similar, because, as you know, there's so much dynamic in the climate, on the climate topic right now, and there's a lot of dynamic in the plastic topic, but there are other topics which are not really affecting business so far. And this framework, I really liked it. I found it this morning as well. Is a continuum of internalization of externalities. So internalization of externalities basically just means considering costs, considering social costs, considering environmental costs, which we haven't considered so far. So if you internalize it, then they suddenly become part of the price. And it's basically a continuum of, when you think about the social trends, some of them might not be internalized at all. So if you think about carbon emissions, 40 years ago, they haven't been financially internalized at all. And I'm sure that there are, and we can think of some of them, there are social trends which we haven't internalized yet at all. So mental health maybe is a good example, that when you think about the work structure or the way output is produced, especially when you think about big consultancies, many people work under huge pressure there, and a lot of output is generated. But we as an economy, we do not price into the outcome, like what is the suffering or the mental health suffering of people who just get burnout after 2 years. We just don't price it in. And so this is on one spectrum. And then you have this interesting part of where society, businesses suddenly start appreciating societal value shifts, and more scientific knowledge is coming to it, and suddenly there's a debate, but it's still not internalized, right? People still buy products and services which have a price where these consequences are not involved. And then you have a step, and plastics is a good example, that a couple of years ago, companies started to commit themselves without any regulatory pressure, without any pressure from the state. They said, well, we consider this as a cost, and we will now start compensating for our plastic waste. The question is, why do they do it? I mean, many reasons. First of all, maybe intrinsic motivation by the CEOs, but probably more importantly, they see it coming, because it's a really, when we think about social norms and sustainability shifting business models, it's not something what happens overnight, but it's a process, and it really starts from the left and it goes to the right. And so we can think it with carbon. Carbon in the 80s, no idea. There was little, I mean, there was evidence, but most people didn't know it. It was before Rio, it was before the big conferences, so it wasn't part of the mindset. Then there was a debate starting in the 90s, in the 2000s, then voluntary internalization started. Certain companies started to compensate their carbon emissions. Now, like more and more people start offsetting their personal carbon emissions, and now we have a climate, climate legislation a couple of weeks ago, and it really full financial internalization is happening, especially if we have the emission trading now more and more accomplished. So why I'm saying that? Because this is really, especially like not the left and not the right, but really in the middle, this is where social entrepreneurship is coming into the equation. And that's where I'm coming into now. But it's really important to have it in the background that it's about shifting what we value as society, and that's why all the business models will be changed, but social entrepreneurs are the ones who sort of make it happen, or sort of are the first movers, bringing society from the left part to the right part. So to start with a definition, there are many definitions, but it's a good summary saying the primary goal of social entrepreneurship is the development of innovative solutions to societal problems by making use of entrepreneurial methods. So it's a very short definition, so it's of course not complete, but we can work with that. And so the question is, based on what we've just we've discussed before, which is true for the overall economy, and of course social entrepreneurs are really only a very small subset, the question is, in this big process of change from non-sustainable economy towards a 100% sustainable economy, what is the function of social entrepreneurs? And I would sum it up to 4 main functions, where, like, with the 850 social initiatives and social ventures we at Project Together have worked with in the last 5 years, I think I mostly saw those 4 functions. So function number 1, social entrepreneurs are really trendsetters. Trendsetters in the way that social entrepreneurs are so much ahead of their time that most social entrepreneurs, they do already offer their product before there's any financial internalization. So you heard about soap bottles, and it's funny because we have a huge collaboration happening with them right now. Come to that later. They started really a few years ago, and at this part, plastic was not at the radar of anyone. So it was really a niche market, if there was any market at all. I doubt it at the time. But they were really already starting, and then with them kind of bringing this product, this soap bottle, to the market, they more or less also created their own market because they used the product to spread awareness. So some of the social entrepreneurs are really market makers, which is a hard job because you cannot just enter a market and say, well, here I am, I have a better product. You have to create the market you're then serving with your own product. So the second function is that social entrepreneurs demonstrate how it can be done differently. What I mean is that a big blocking, or like a big blocking for change, is that once there's a certain appreciation in society that a social problem is real and that a cost should be internalized, the first thing you will hear from critics is, yes, that's true, but we cannot do it differently. Or if we price it in, like if we consider these costs, then we will go out of market, and there's no possible alternative bringing the same value to the customer with a different price. So using the soap bottles example, if you had asked people from the plastics industry 10 or 15 years ago whether it's possible that customers do drink all day, like drink water all day long without a plastics bottle, they would say it's not economically viable, it's not like product-wise feasible. And soap bottles did it. They sold enough soap bottles to show the market that it's possible and that they can deliver a product with the same satisfaction, or like with the same, they fulfill the function in the same way as the plastic industry is doing, but they do it in a more sustainable way. So social entrepreneurs sort of are the ones who do not only know how not to do it, but they actually show a way of how to do it. And this can really inspire business leaders, because once there's proof that it's possible, and this relates to the third point, once they make the case that it's possible, then business leaders might follow, because they say, well, I would like to do it, and now as I know that there's a way of how to produce it and how to bring it to the market, then they will follow. So social entrepreneurs are first movers in a way, and they are the ones making the proof, which is also a hard job at certain times. And of course, this idea of making the case is not only true of showing, to show the public and to show other companies that it's actually possible to produce a product and to find a price where a sufficient number of customers are willing to pay for it, but also to show that there's a market and that this market is growing. And so it's a really interesting dynamic that social entrepreneurs oftentimes are sort of creating the market, making the proof that there is a market which they've just produced themselves, then they're growing with their awareness. So oftentimes social startups they're growing really with the growing market. So it's there's it's a multi-function, and that's why I would say it's a much tougher job to be a social entrepreneur rather than just a normal entrepreneur, because there's not a proper market in place yet. So to give you more examples, you discussed soap bottles. You don't have to go into that. It's interesting because soap bottles has been so successful in the last few years and so profitable that they now decided to support and incubate new business ideas for how to reduce plastic waste. And together with Project Together, they they started the Soul Incubator. So Soul Bottles, the Soul Incubator, where now more than 90 social ventures, early stage social ventures, has just started into the incubation phase. So you see, like Soul Bottles has been so profitable that they can afford to pay for an entire incubator and to pay for scholarships for new sort of plastic founders. And they decided actually to, like, all the profits at the end of the year, to reinvest them into new plastic startups. So this is really a good case for showing that a social startup can be very profitable. But to look at other examples, I mean, Fairphone, really good example. Every one of us is having the Fairphone, not the Fairphone, but a smartphone in the pocket, and there's not so much awareness about the materials which are used in all our smartphones. Where do they come from? Under which conditions have people created those iPhones? And maybe this awareness is not strong enough, but again, there has been a company like Fairphone, and they decided that they will produce a smartphone which actually avoids all the negative costs, especially with respect to the workers, that they produce in decent conditions and with decent salary. At the same time, that those materials are basically are extracted in an environmentally friendly way, and they made the case that it's possible to bring a smartphone on the market with a similar quality and a similar price, but without all those social and environmental negative effects. And now, of course, not every one of you has a Fairphone, probably not, because they still have to improve, but there is already a niche market of sufficient customers switching to the Fairphone. Maybe some one of you will do it as well after this lecture. And certainly this awareness of where do materials in your smartphone, where do they come from? This awareness will increase for sure. This awareness will increase in the next years, similar to this entire question of where do all the products come from? What is with the transparency of the supply chain will massively increase in the next years, and I'm sure that in 10 years the Fairphone will be the new normal, maybe because until then Apple will have switched to those techniques which the Fairphone, as a not very well-known startup, is using today. So we can go through different other examples. Share is a nice example. They really made the case in the last 2 years that customers, if customers do their grocery shopping in the supermarkets, then if they can do something good while shopping, they will do it. So Share started to bring normal products like chocolate, water, but also like soap. They're bringing now, I think, 3 or 4 other products into supermarkets as well. They make it possible for you to buy a product and at the same time donate the same amount of which you shop to directly to an NGO. Like if you buy a bottle of water, you basically make it possible for a person to live or to get water for an entire day. And they had a really smart model, and they actually convinced Rewe and DM that actually the market is ready for that. And so Rewe and DM decided to bring share products in every single supermarket all over Germany, which resulted then in the fact that they now, I think, sold more than 10 million products in the last 2 years. So they made the case that the market is ready, and they basically also provided the proof. Last one, Original Unverpackt, also a nice example. Milena Klimbowski, she started a couple of years ago, and at this point, every supermarket would have told her it's impossible to shop or to do your grocery without the use of plastics. And now, as there's more and more regulation coming for like single-use plastics, more and more regulation coming from the European Union, and suddenly more and more supermarkets start switching to the techniques, the Original Unverpackt technique, which they already implemented a couple of years ago. So these examples are just there to really demonstrate this function of being a first mover, this function of creating the own market, and the function of social entrepreneurs to really provide the proof that it's economically viable and that it's feasible, like product-wise. Any questions at this point? Okay. We will have a longer discussion anyway. So where does Project Together come into this equation? What's the role? What are we doing? I mean, many of the things I've been saying, I can only say because we've been doing this work for the last 7 years and really learning every single day more about what do we have to do, what kind of support do social entrepreneurs need to really drive systematic social change. So at Project Together, we realized that social entrepreneurs are a main driver for this change towards a sustainable economy. They have the functions which I just explained before. But we realized that they are so decentralized and so fragmented that we need a social acceleration platform. So we need a platform where to combine or where to bring all those different startups which are testing things at different places, at really different teams. How do we bring them together? And also, how do we give them the resources to make this journey from there's no market, then really kind of creating this own market, then making it so making it so public that more and more customers are adopting it. How do we give them the resources they need to really survive this journey? Because as I said before, really like the biggest impact social entrepreneurs can have when they start from the left and then after 10 years they got to the right. This is the biggest impact. But this is so tough. You really need all the resources, all the support, and mostly this is not given. Because when you talk to VCs and if you talk to investors, they will only invest in business models which are already established markets, where they are kind of a constant stream of revenue. But this is obviously not given with social entrepreneurs. So we came up with the fact saying we need an infrastructure which really helps social entrepreneurs to make this journey from the left to the right. And specifically, we said like we have to solve 3 problems. Basically, how can we bring startup mentality into these social problems? That's the second one. The first one is the realization, as I already said before, that the only way of how we can deal with those complex social problems we have right now is to test many solutions at the same time. So this is basically everything I said already before, but not everyone would agree with the fact that we need startups to make social progress. Because some people might say, well, we already know what we have to do, we just have to implement it. But I say, or like Project Together strongly believes that we exactly need those social startups because we don't know yet what are exactly the products and what are the services which will be the best ones to decrease carbon emissions, to really provide elderly care for 9 million people. We just don't know it, and that's why we need the social startups. But the big problem is there's a lot of momentum right now. There's a lot of people starting initiatives and ventures because they don't want to just observe what is happening. They want to be part. They themselves want to be part of the change. But there's no ecosystem which really connects all the support, all the funding, all the mentors, all the expertise. And that's why we said, okay, we have to combine that. We have to what we really have to do is, and I think especially in times of Fridays for Future, now the next few years will be so important to make sure that there's not only a lot of momentum and a lot of willingness to change, but that we really transform it into real change. And just a few facts. As a social acceleration platform, we have incubated, supported, built up more than 850 initiatives and early stage social startups in Germany. We are working together with all different players, not only startups, but on the other side, foundations, corporates, public institutions, individuals, family offices. So everyone who is needed to really get the social entrepreneurs going and really kind of getting from the left side of the diagram to the right side, we're kind of all bundling them into one platform. So that's how you can imagine it. Because what we learned is that it's already tough as an entrepreneur to find your way, it's tough to get the resources you need, but it's particularly hard for social entrepreneurs, and that's why there are not so many successful ones. And we said we definitely have to change that, and that's what we do. That's what we did. So this is just another visualization of how we work. Maybe there are a few ones among you interested in the idea of startup acceleration and social startup ecosystem. So for the ones who are more interested in this field as such, or want to kind of dig deeper, feel free to reach out to me, because the way we develop this platform is really different to any other incubator or accelerator out there. What's mostly different, just on a side note, is that most programs are designed in a way that you apply as a startup and then you get certain resources, certain expertise, but it's not really needs-based. It's not really it doesn't really fit what you as an individual startup need. So we realized, okay, we have to move beyond this idea of startup programs. We really have to bundle all the resources out there, and then we have to find a mechanism to allocate those resources exactly where it is needed and when it is needed. And so we are really running very successful with that. But reach out to me if you're interested in that. So I think we can skip that. One fundamental insight in the last few years have been that on the one hand, you need those social startups who test new ideas, who make the first move, who go to the market. But if you don't embed them, or if you don't put them in touch with the relevant systemic players, and I mean the most powerful corporates, mostly the most powerful corporates, but also with the policymakers, with the public institutions, if you do not connect them, then it will never, they will never have systemic impact. They will, at some point, they will just die, because oftentimes this change from the left side non-internalization at all towards full internalization is only possible if at some point, and it's always better earlier than later, if at some point a big institution says, well, your case convinced me, I will adopt your case, and we will make it big together. Because when we go back here, so imagine a startup, and let's take Share as an example. So Share is the one-on-one supermarket new product. I mean, here they started a few years ago saying, well, actually, when you do supermarket shopping, you should be able to do something good. And they just had the assumption that customers are willing to do it. And they started off with it, and then they felt that there's some traction, and they started to think about how can we implement it. And then here in the middle, the blue one, that's where basically Rewe came in and said, well, the legislator is not really forcing us to do it, but we just see a business opportunity in that. We can see the trend in there. So let's adopt it. Let's be like Rewe. Let's be a first mover let's be a first mover ourselves. And then Rewe is suddenly coming part of this theory of change, because then you suddenly have a market, because one of the big market participants is adopting a technique which is not internalized yet. So based on this idea of that you need the big players, we started to make, or like to come up with thematic challenges, that we realized that we have to, when we support social startups, we should filter them we should filter them towards the specific problem they are solving. So is it climate? Is it the future of neighborhood or the future of urban mobility? Is it the use of plastics? And then really getting grown-ups, big companies, big institutions on board, which are willing to adopt those new solutions which are getting created there, and who are kind of already pre-committing that once they're good, like once those social startups create good products, they're willing to adopt them. So here we talk a lot about, and this is also a big challenge right now, that there are good social startups, but they do not interact with the system sufficiently. And what I mean with the system, I mean the established institutions. And this is one major challenge in the entire sphere of sustainability and social innovation, that many of the social entrepreneurs, they have the right motivation, but one thing which is sometimes kind of a stumbling block, then how to interact with the players who are actually which are actually the problem, right? Because sometimes you as a social entrepreneur, you really want to solve a problem like the plastic crisis, and then you realize to really get rid of the problem, or to really get my own solution into the big market, I would actually have to collaborate with an institution, with a company, which I think I actually do not like so much, because I think they are actually part of the problem. They are exactly the polluters. But at the same time, they are the ones having the leverage. They can make it happen. So this is a big conflict of to what extent do we need the system to change, because otherwise maybe 1% of the market is adopting your solution, but not more. So this is a big question. So this is the example of Rewe and Share, a wonderful, good example. There we can go into other examples on the plastic startups. You can look them up on the internet as well. Surplus is really becoming an interesting platform right now. Surplus makes it possible for you to sell plastics and basically sell plastic, get money for that, and also for others to buy plastics when they need it. So really putting a price to plastics, and this works very, very, very well. To sum it up and to start a discussion and all your questions. I think lessons learned. What's sure, we're at the beginning of an unstoppable movement. And what I feel right now from all the different players, it's a movement where we really have the opportunity to create sort of a responsible capitalism made in Germany or made in Europe. So I think we're right now at a really interesting turning point, and everyone is needed. Also, every one of you is needed to be part of this movement. Companies are expected to add value to society. I think this is now common sense. And we've already seen in a couple of corporates that if they don't do it, they certainly lose their license to operate, and they're getting pushed out of the market. So when you think about the big reputation scandals in the last few years, some companies really got pushed out of the market, and some others almost got killed because society just basically didn't accept their behavior, and customers stopped buying their product. Social startups are paving the path towards a responsible economy. And as I said, social startups are the triggers and can be the triggers for shifting entire markets. One big thing, the example of Rewe and the example of Share is the best example. We cannot solve the big challenges without the big players, and we cannot solve those problems without the players who actually caused the problem. Because wherever you have the polluters or like the actors causing the problem, there's also the biggest leverage for improvement. So more into the discussion. And last but not least, we really have to forge new partnerships. One thing I'm most annoyed about oftentimes is that there are so many prejudices between corporates, NGOs, social entrepreneurs, policymakers. There are prejudices and mistrust. Mistrust which really makes it impossible to collaborate. And oftentimes that's the reason why no change is happening, because the partnerships, the trust between the different players, between an NGO, between a corporate, between a social startup, between a politician, the mistrust is there, and we need trust instead. And last but not least, what it means for the economy, what it means for businesses, is that responsibility is not about writing checks and making press statements anymore. The CSR, corporate social responsibility, cannot be part of the marketing department anymore. What responsibility means is really transforming the core of the business models, and this will happen in the next 10 years, and I think it's the most exciting thing to be part in. And now I would like to open the discussion. So feel free to start or shoot with your questions. Thank you.